we talk about great leadership, we often start with what feels like a pretty simple test. Are you ethical? Are you honest?
Do you have integrity?
Exactly. We sort of assume that if a leader is true to their core values, if they're fundamentally a good person, that's enough.
Yeah.
That it'll automatically translate into leading a team well and building a healthy culture.
It really sounds ideal on paper, doesn't it? I mean, good people should make good leaders. But the sources we dove into today really, they challenge that idea pretty fundamentally.
They do.
They suggest that integrity and honesty, well, it's just the bare minimum. That's the price of admission. What truly defines your impact, especially in these high-pressure jobs, are the visible behaviors you show every day, the ones you might not even realize you're modeling for your team.
And that is the critical insight right there. So our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the unintended negative impact of a leader's most visible habits. We're looking at how that relentless, and let's be honest, often exhausting pursuit of perfect leadership, just the way a leader naturally works, can actually send toxic signals and set impossible standards for the very people they're trying to lead.
And the context here is so important. This kind of realization, it often comes from a deep moment of self-reflection. One of our sources talks about a leader who is reviewing their own processes, their own way of working.
Right.
And they mentioned that, look, whether or not there's a formal diagnosis for these intense processes, like ADHD is mentioned as one possible framework, the key takeaway isn't the label, it's the self-awareness.
It's the insight.
It's the insight. It's about recognizing that leading by example, if your example is burnout, just isn't sustainable anymore. That old saying, do as I say, not as I do, is, well, it's completely useless in the modern workplace.
So let's unpack this huge gap that opens up between what you intend and what actually happens. On one hand, you have the leader's internal world. They genuinely want to set a high standard for quality, for dedication, for availability.
Of course. The intentions are good.
But then you have the external world, where the team is watching every single move and interpreting those actions as the actual company standard.
And that gap, that's where all the damage starts. The leader just sees these habits as their normal process. It's how they've always operated, probably how they got successful in the first place.
It's well-intended.
It is.
Yeah.
But the source makes this really blunt, necessary distinction. Just because it's your normal process doesn't mean it's good for the people you're leading. In fact, it's often the opposite.
Because what you see is, just me keeping up with my emails or me pushing for quality control. That becomes this impossible, irrational yardstick for everyone else on the team.
Exactly. That's the core problem. These high-intensity habits, they set unrealistic modeling of behaviors. If the person at the top is available 204/7 or demands flawless execution on every tiny task, the team just internalizes that. They think this is what's required to survive or to get ahead.
And the fallout is, it's so predictable. Your team members either feel constantly inadequate because they just can't keep up that pace, they have families, they need to sleep, they're just wired differently.
Or they get confused.
Right. Or they get confused. They see their leader as constantly stressed out, but that state is being called normal or success. It just destroys any sense of psychological safety or, clarity on what's actually expected.
It forces the team to mimic the exhaustion, not the effectiveness.
So if we accept that the intention isn't bad, but the outcome is, well, toxic, we have to look at the specific habits. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the source gives us a pretty clear checklist of these behaviors that bosses exhibit.
Yeah, we can really group these into 4 major areas that undermine trust and stability.
Okay, let's start with the first one. Emotional and reactionary behavior. This is all about volatility and boundaries, or the lack of them. The source points to being really sensitive to criticism or even just perceived rejection.
Right, which often results in these irrational, overly emotional responses to what are actually pretty minor issues.
So if your team sees you, the leader, the person who's supposed to be the pillar of stability, taking professional critique as a personal attack,
they're instantly trained to just walk on eggshells. Initiative just dies. Why would you risk innovating or giving feedback if the result might be this outsized emotional backlash from your boss?
And the other side of that coin is often this kind of ingrained subservience. The leader avoids necessary conflict. They'll actively duck a confrontation even when they really need to hold a boundary or fix a bigger problem.
And that combination, the volatility and the avoidance, that is just poisonous for a team. Because if the tough issues are just left to fester because the leader won't face any friction, the team learns that integrity and problem solving, well, they're less important than keeping things superficially calm.
They lose faith.
They lose complete faith in the leader's ability to handle conflict, which forces the team to either step in when they shouldn't have to or just put up with the dysfunction.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's move to the second category. Perfectionism and pace. This is really where that unsustainable work culture gets built. We're talking about aiming for absolute perfection on everything, instead of knowing when good enough is actually good enough so you can move on to the next thing.
You know, perfectionism is so often just procrastination in a fancy coat. And when leaders model it, they're basically mandating process addiction. You spend all this time polishing tiny details that have no real business value.
And what does that do to the speed of things?
Well, it leads to what the source called a ridiculous operational pace. It specifically notes leaders working at ridiculous pace and needing to pull ungodly hours to keep on top. Just think about that message.
Yeah.
If the boss has to work 17 hours a day just to meet the standard they themselves set, how can anyone else on the team, who probably has a heavier workload, ever hope to survive? The behavior being modeled is basically self-harm. It's burnout.
It creates this vicious cycle of exhaustion. The high standard demands the ungodly hours. The hours lead to exhaustion, which leads to more mistakes.
Which then requires more perfectionism and more time to fix them.
It's a loop. And it makes scalable growth impossible because your team is always operating past capacity.
Precisely. If you want a sustainable organization, the leader has to model a sustainable workday, period.
Which brings us right to the third area, and this one is so relatable. Availability and boundary setting failure. This is where work just bleeds into every single corner of your private life.
Oh, yeah.
The source points to leaders being always available even when on holiday, and that universal modern sin, checking work WhatsApps, often ruining an otherwise lovely day.
When a leader can't unplug, they are implicitly telling their team that they can't unplug either. If you're on a team and you know your boss is checking emails from a beach somewhere, you feel this pressure to be monitoring your own inbox.
Yes, you do.
This failure to set a personal boundary means the team never, ever gets the deep recovery they need to stay sharp. They're just constantly in this state of low-level professional anxiety.
And it even extends to physical health. The source mentions turning up at work events when unwell.
That one is so damaging. It's maybe intended to show dedication, but what it actually tells the team is that your personal health is less important than being visible. It normalizes burnout, but worse, it normalizes spreading germs.
It really does.
It sets this dangerous precedent that resting when you're sick is a sign of weakness. It undermines every single health policy the company might have on paper.
It's just this constant performance of dedication, even when it's at your own expense and your team's expense. Okay, last one. The fourth area, consistency and people-pleasing.
Ah, yes.
Authenticity.
Or the lack of it. We see huge problems coming from inconsistency and the desperate need to people-pleaser. People-pleasing leadership creates what I call managerial whiplash. The source describes leaders molding to the needs of those you meet rather than doing the right thing. So if your position changes based on the last person you talked to,
then your team learns that the only way to get things done is to just lobby you constantly, not to focus on what's actually best for the organization.
and trust just evaporates, doesn't it? If your team knows that decisions are based on who yelled the loudest or who flattered you most recently, then your company strategy is basically meaningless.
It is.
Absolutely. The lack of a stable internal compass just creates chaos. And that people-pleasing trait, it also leads to the leader's schedule being completely jammed, busying your diary and saying yes to everything.
And if the leader's saying yes to everything, the whole organization learns that saying no is not an option.
That's it, right there. Saying no is arguably one of the most critical skills for managing workload and avoiding burnout. But if the person at the top models this frantic, overcommitted schedule and never declines a request, then the team member who tries to push back or manage their own scope feels like they're committing career suicide.
It makes healthy prioritization seem unacceptable.
Exactly.
So if you tie all these behaviors together, the emotional volatility, the crazy pace, the zero boundaries, the constant people-pleasing, we get to the final synthesis from the leader and the source. These processes are just exhausting, and that word is so key.
It is. It's the ultimate confirmation that these standards can't be sustained. If the leader, who has the most control, finds their own system draining, then it's just mathematically impossible for the whole team to maintain it without catastrophic levels of burnout and turnover.
The big insight is realizing that if your pursuit of perfection is exhausting for you, it is toxic for your organization. So if you're listening to this and you're recognizing yourself, or maybe your manager, what's the path forward? What are the solutions the source suggests for fixing this?
Well, the first step is totally internal. It's self-knowledge. Solution number one is you have to gain deep insight into your processes as a leader. You have to turn off the autopilot.
Hmm.
You need to understand why you check WhatsApp on vacation, why you chase perfection, why you avoid confrontation. You have to get to the root cause of your behavioral patterns.
So self-awareness is that first crucial gear shift. You stop the automatic destructive modeling and you start making conscious choices. But you can't really do that in a vacuum, which I guess leads to the second solution.
Validation through team feedback.
Right.
And this is the vulnerability step. The recommendation is to start checking processes out with your team for their honest feedback. It means actually inviting them into the conversation about your flaws.
So you might say something like, hey, I know I tend to answer emails at 11 p.m. When I do that, what does it really tell you about what I expect?
Exactly. You're moving the process from this unconscious, destructive modeling to a conscious, transparent discussion. You're basically asking your team to help you define what a healthy standard should be instead of just imposing your own exhausted one on them.
But there's a huge prerequisite for this, which the source really hammers home.
Oh, it's non-negotiable. For your team to be truly honest with you about your draining processes, you must have already built a level of trust with colleagues beforehand.
Because if you ask them for the truth on Monday, but you've been emotionally volatile for the last 6 months, they're just going to lie to you.
Of course, they'll say everything is fine because they're afraid of the professional consequences of telling you that you are the problem.
Psychological safety isn't the outcome of this conversation. It has to be the prerequisite.
That's the whole shift. You replace the exhausting performance of perfection with genuine transparency and vulnerability, and those are the real building blocks of trust.
This whole deep dive, it's such a powerful challenge to that traditional idea of leadership perfection. It shows us that leadership modeling goes way beyond just good intentions. Your integrity might be rock solid, but your visible habits, your normal process, could be setting an unhealthy, confusing, and ultimately impossible standard for your whole team.
And the final big realization is just that moment of insight. It's recognizing that your normal process, even if you mean well, is actively undermining your team's well-being and their capability, leaving them feeling inadequate or just plain confused.
And if we take that one step further for a final thought, if a leader's own attempt at perfection is inherently described as exhausting, what are the long-term systemic costs of leading an entire organization where exhaustion is the primary modeled behavior? What happens to creativity, to retention, to innovation when the baseline expectation is just running on fumes? That's something powerful for you to mull over on your own.